The second speaker, Dr. Helena Ray, a senior lecturer in law and an expert in this field, who will address other aspects of the question.
Thank you, good evening, and thank you to JCWI very much for inviting me this evening. And I was asked to speak particularly about the family migration consultation, and I just want to put it into a little bit of context. As you know, this consultation opened in July 2011, it closed earlier this month. But it, as has already been indicated, there is a very long-standing concern about family migration. And I think that what we have to note is that there is always this cycle of reaction and liberalisation that goes on and has been going on really since the mid-1960s in terms of family migration, because it is a particularly problematic category of immigration. It's a form of immigration that can't be controlled in the way that labour migration can be controlled. You can't select marriage migrants in the same way that you can select labour migrants. And therefore, you have enormous pressure on governments that want to reduce migration and want to control the terms on which people enter to clamp down on family migration and in particular marriage migration. But on the other hand, they always have the countervailing pressure of the UK residents who want to marry people from abroad, and in particular from certain communities who may or may not have some electoral pressure to bring to bear in order to bring liberalisation. So I think we obviously had a long period of very restrictive immigration control up until 1997. I think, although I have been, and many of us would be, extremely critical of the Labour government, particularly in its last years, we have to acknowledge that there was some liberalisation, some moves made towards having a fairer regime in the earlier part of its period in office, and that it was only towards the end of its period that it became more concerned with having with following the lead elsewhere in Europe, I would say, and having a more selective and restrictive form of immigration control for family migrants. And the other thing to note about that is that family migration is controversial across Europe. That every single European country that certainly in Western Europe has concerns about family migration. They're looking at each other, they're watching each other, they're talking to each other, and you can see that in the influence of the policy directions that this government and the previous Labour government was seeking to adopt. The current government commitment is to reduce net migration to tens of thousands, an aim that is probably unfeasible given that it cannot control emigration, and therefore how it hopes to control net migration is very questionable. But it's also clear that it's not only a numbers question. Damien Green has said, when he was, not long after he was appointed in September 2010, that we need to solve two problems simultaneously. We need not just to cut the numbers, but to make sure we gain maximum benefits from those in the new, smaller pool of immigrants. And in that speech, he went on to outline proposals to reduce the numbers of students, of workers, and of family members entering the UK. So it is quite clear that family migration is simply another form of migration. It is not something that it is not something that's conceptualised or seen at all, really, in terms of the rights of the UK residents and citizens to live with their family members from abroad. It is simply a problem. They did, of course, bring the language requirement for spouses forward to November 2010, and then they later brought in this consultation. Some of the key proposals in it, you're probably familiar with most of these, but I would like to mention just a few of them. The new minimum income threshold above income support, which has already been mentioned, and they say, ominously, a review of third-party support, clearly hoping to undo the effect of the Mahad case and prevent extended families and communities from supporting migrants through financial assistance. They want to increase the probationary period for spouses from 2 years to 5 years, including for couples who've already lived abroad for a substantial period. So even if you've lived abroad with your spouse for 15 years, you would come to the UK, you would not have any entitlement to settlement for 5 years. Following from that would be that access to non-contributory benefits would not be available for 5 years. They have also mentioned the possibility of granting only 1 year's leave for new relationships. So if you are in an arranged marriage, which I think is really their target, or in a whirlwind romance, which I think is probably a side effect, you will initially only get 1 year's leave. And when you do settle, you will have to have language competence to B1, including possibly reading and writing. They're very concerned about sham marriages. They want to identify the content of a genuine and continuing relationship. Well, I wish them luck with that, because I think many of us would have difficulty. They would like to, or they're considering the adoption of the combined attachment requirement that's been implemented in Denmark. Now that requirement requires a couple to show that their attachment to Denmark is significantly greater than to any other country. Now you can see precisely at which type of migrant that proposal is aimed at. And they also, they have the indications of that this might be the case. They look at things like length of residence, connections in both countries, where you've been educated, language, and the number of visits that you might have already made to Denmark, which is something I'll return to. They're concerned about forced marriage. Their criminalisation is back on the agenda. They want to maintain a minimum age of 21. Whether that's feasible or not following Kilo is something that I won't discuss here. They talk about sponsorship bans for those who have been involved in forced marriages, and the involvement of, so that if you're considered to have been involved or implicated in a forced marriage, you will no longer be able to sponsor a spouse. The involvement of social services where there are learning difficulties or particular vulnerability. Other family members. They also want a minimum income threshold there, and possibly a health insurance requirement. Now, I'm absolutely sure that this one is completely a non-goer. If you're bringing in your elderly mother from abroad, I'm not sure how anybody will be able to get health insurance to cover her existing ailments, her future ailments, and so on. It seems to me that this is something that must have been thought up on the back of an envelope, and I very much doubt they've spoken to insurance companies about its viability. A 5-year probationary period for all adult dependent relatives, including those who have been admitted because of compelling, compassionate circumstances. Any adult relative who comes to the UK is already very vulnerable, and yet they will not be able to settle and have any sort of security for 5 years. They're talking about lifting the age threshold for elderly dependent relatives, because the pension age is going up, because we're all going to have to work until we're 80. Perhaps we should bring in similar requirements for migrants too. More examination of whether dependency requires admission, or if the relative can be supported in the country of origin. Now that is really, I'm not entirely sure what they're going to do above and beyond the existing immigration rules on that. They're proposing, with regard to children, that if you are close to the age of majority, if you're already 17, that you might only get a short period of leave, because once you're 18, you can fend for yourself and you can qualify in your own right. They also want a language requirement for those between 16 and 65, both before entry and before settlement. Also a number of suggestions around the points-based system, and of course removal of appeal rights for family visitors except on human rights or discrimination grounds. So what does this tell us about how the government views family migrants? Well, the language is already, I think we know. Clearly the current system is presented as lacking sustainability, fairness and common sense. Common sense, again, is another of those concepts that is completely undefinable in my view. Family migrants are quite clearly a burden on the taxpayer, deficient in terms of their attachment to the UK, deficient in terms of integration, and prone to abuse the system. And I think very clearly the critical issue here is not actually family migrants and their deficiencies, or not their deficiencies, but public perception. As Theresa May says in the foreword, we want to see a system that is fair and that is seen to be fair to applicants and, more importantly, to the public. Thank you. So this is really about creating a problem and then the government solving it for them, to applause from the press, elements of the press and media anyway. So, of course, there are many, many unanswered, unaddressed questions in this consultation. They don't tell us in what ways the current measures to detect sham marriages are failing. They don't tell us what proportion of family migrants claim public funds, because, as we already know, they don't, they can't. We don't know what proportion of serial sponsors, as they're called, this is a new concept, have entered sham marriages, or whether they simply had the misfortune, as happens to many of us, to have a relationship breakdown. We don't know, they don't investigate why so many visitor appeals are decided on new evidence. Is it because people make these applications without giving them due thought and without reading about what's needed? Or maybe it's because the requirements are somewhat arbitrary, not clearly explained, and that more information could be given. To whom is this combined attachment criterion going to apply? In Denmark, you're exempt if you've lived in Denmark for more than 28 years as a resident or as a citizen. Now, I think, again, you can begin to see the contours of what this policy is about. You're going to have British citizens who are under 28 who will be subject to different requirements and different criteria to those who are over 28. How would this combined attachment requirement help to detect sham marriages? I'm not entirely sure where you've had your education, which language you speak, whether you've visited the UK in the past, has any bearing on the genuineness of your relationship. It seems to me to actually be completely immaterial. Why do migrants not visit the UK before making an application? I don't think I need to answer that. So, many more questions. What basis would recently arrived 18-year-olds be able to stay on? You're 17 and a half, you arrive as a child, you're given 6 months leave, and then you have to qualify in your own right. I'm not entirely sure what visas are available to 18-year-olds, but who are not students and not skilled workers, etc. But I'd be grateful if they'd tell me. So anyway, what is going to be the effect of these proposals? A reduced pool of eligible migrants. Poor and less educated migrants and those from certain regions are going to be less likely to qualify. Prolonged insecurity for those who are already here. And I think the whole debate around Article 8 is extremely pertinent here because, of course, those people who've lived in the UK with their families for 5 years will have a very strong Article 8 claim at that point. And I think a change to the profile of family migrants and indeed to ethnic minority communities themselves. Let's look at what's already happening. Let's look at the pre-entry language testing for spouses. Now this is apparently a very undemanding criterion. You have to reach the level of A1 on the Common European Framework for Languages, which is the most basic level. It's minimal in speaking and listening. It sounds, it's easy to present this as something that's just a way of making life easier for people and, it's entirely reasonable. The government implemented it without establishing the availability of tuition or tests. Appropriate tuition is simply not available to many people living in rural areas. Where you can get tuition is often literacy-based, even though the test is speaking and listening only. And any educationalist will tell you that appropriate tuition in languages is very important. Somebody living in a rural area without literacy is simply not going to be able to find somebody in their local village or their local town to give them the sort of tuition they need to pass that test. And what's more, the tests are not available. There's only a very limited number of approved providers, and most of those tests actually require literacy skills to pass them. You have to be able to read in English, you have to be able to answer multiple choice questions in order to pass the test. The exemptions are very narrowly drawn. In order to know whether you're going to meet the exemption for disability or for exceptional compassionate circumstances, you have to make your application, pay your visa fee of £810, and then found that actually, sorry, we don't accept your exemption. You can't find out about these tests. I've done some work on this. I set a colleague of mine to find out what tests were available in a number of countries. She is a postgraduate British speaker with a fast internet connection. She couldn't work out what you should do. So essentially, to pass the language test, you need education, you need internet skills, you need financial resources, and you need a vast deal of determination and resilience. The sort of human cultural capital that not everybody possesses. And what's more, this test is of almost no value to migrants. That has been very well established. When you come to the UK, you will be placed in the beginner's class anyway. A1 is not linguistically recognised as a level of achievement. It is an intermediate step on the way to a higher level of achievement, and therefore you'll simply be put in the beginner's class anyway. And that has been the experience, incidentally, elsewhere in Europe where these tests have been introduced. There are absolutely no use. They don't actually prepare you. They don't actually give you any tools for getting along in the country when you arrive. It won't reduce the need for translation services because, theoretically anyway, these are only speaking and listening tests, so you won't have learned to read. You'll still need translators just as much as before. And anyway, these tests are meant to be about integration. Anybody who's read any of the literature on integration will know that integration is about far more than language. And in fact, such a test is actually a barrier to integration. It's very hard to see how anybody can integrate while they're living abroad and trying to learn English in a rural village in Pakistan or somewhere. So what is the purpose of this test? Well, and what is the purpose, of course, of all these particular measures? To answer this, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about what's happened in the Netherlands, where they have a similarly restrictive regime for spousal migration. And since implementing this regime, they've seen a sharp decline in the numbers of applicants, with larger falls for particular nationalities, and in case of the Netherlands, Turkey, Morocco, Indonesia and Brazil. What they've also seen is a change in the profile of marriage migrants. Those who succeed are on average younger and they're better educated. What's more, it's changing the practices within the communities of migrant descent in that country. There are now a much lower level of international arranged marriages amongst the Dutch population of Turkish and Moroccan descent. So in other words, these proposals are about changing the nature, changing the profile and the attitudes, not only of marriage migrants, but the behaviour of the communities themselves. So, to conclude, I think what these proposals are about, what this consultation is about, is making sure that family migration will be a privilege for the prosperous and the well-educated, those who earn a lot, those who have resources, and it is also about ensuring that what are regarded as communities who don't comply with majority norms, who don't behave the way that we, the majority, think they should, are forced actually into a greater degree of compliance.